Great. Just a test. Is the microphone working? Not yet? Yes, now it's working. Brilliant. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to all the participants who are joining us both offline here in the room, but also virtually. I hope you can see and hear us also in the online room already. I'm Julia Ebner. I'm co-host of the Calleva-Airey Neave Global Security Seminar Series. And I'm really delighted to welcome you all here to what I think will be a very fascinating and also highly timely discussion and seminar on prevent and counter-extremism in the UK. We are really delighted and honored to welcome Lord David Anderson of Ipswich here today for this seminar. And I would like to introduce him briefly before then handing the floor to him for the presentation. We'll then also have time for a Q&A later on. And also to the online participants, you're very welcome to post any of your questions in the chat function, and we'll try to, depending on how many in the room will have questions, we'll try to follow up with them in the Q&A and reply to them. So Lord David Anderson of Ipswich is the Independent Prevent Commissioner and the UK's former independent reviewer of terrorism legislation. He's a barrister at Brick Court Chambers, a crossbench life peer in the House of Lords, a visiting professor at the Faculty of Law of King's College London, and the chair of the advisory board of the UCL European Institute. He was knighted in the Queen's 2018 birthday honours for services to national security and civil liberties. And I think it's fair to say that he has been one of the most influential figures in the United Kingdom in shaping the legal frameworks around terrorism and around counter-extremism policies. When I first encountered Lord Anderson's work, it was actually in my very first job as a researcher, getting into that field of researching terrorism and extremism. And it was his work that it really inspired me and taught me a lot about the legal frameworks here in the UK and the approaches to counter-terrorism and counter-extremism. So I'm very honored that we're joined by David today. And perhaps just as a brief introduction to our topic of today, we are at a point in time where I think we're really seeing rapid changes in the extremism landscape, both here in the UK, but also internationally, where, of course, digital media, the spread of misinformation, hybrid threats, and also other phenomena, especially grievances around the poly crisis that we're seeing globally, have been exploited by extremists. And we're seeing a rise in youth radicalization, as has been reflected in recent numbers, both here in the UK, in the radicalization statistics, but also abroad. And also new forms of nihilistic violence, post-ideological violence, as well as hybrid ideologies, which are called mixed, unstable, and unclear. I'm sure we can talk more about all the different challenges in the landscape and also the different trends on the horizon. And I really look forward to a discussion, and over to you. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you, Julia, for that excessively kind introduction. You talked about inspiration. It's now very much in the opposite direction. And you should know from the start that, unlike Julia, I am not a true expert in counter-extremism, although I've had to learn quite a lot about prevent during the course of this year when I was appointed by the Home Secretary to review effectively the prevent strategy. So I hope when we come to questions, you'll make good use of Julia's presence as well as mine, and that she will have an opportunity to tell us some of what she knows and some of what she's working on. Prevent is one of the 4 Ps in the contest strategy, which was famously invented by Sir David Omand, former director of GCHQ, when he was in his bath. And he had the rather snappy idea of calling the 4 Ps prevent, pursue, which is the criminal bit, if you like, protect, which is physical protection, and prepare, which is building resilience in the population. But it's key to understand right from the start that prevent was part of a counter-terrorism strategy. It wasn't part of a counter-extremism strategy, even though there is obviously some overlap there. And in its current iteration, and Prevent has evolved, I won't take you through all the ways in which it has. My report, Lessons for Prevent, is quite a good way into that subject if you're interested in it. But it now has 3 objectives. The first is the closest, if you like, to counter-extremism, and it's called Tackling the Ideological Causes of Terrorism. And that is something that is done in part with the help of CSOs. It's done partly, or was done partly, by a Home Office body called RICU, which used to do what they call strategic communications, or what its enemies would probably have called propaganda. Interestingly, whether for reasons of cost or because it wasn't very effective, RICU has now stopped doing that. And all it does now is provide lightly classified fact sheets which tell interested people what's going on the ground, new ideologies, new trends, and so on. The second is really the centre of what most people mean when they talk about Prevent, and it was the exclusive focus of my report, Lessons for Prevent. It's called Intervening Early to Support People Susceptible to Radicalisation. There's a rather clunky definition of radicalisation in the guidance, but essentially this is the Prevent duty and it is channel, and I'll go on to say a bit more about those in a moment. And then the final part of it is enabling people who've already engaged in terrorism to disengage and rehabilitate. That's called, confusingly, DDP, which stands for desistance and disengagement. Useful words, or interesting words, because, of course, they do not include the word de-radicalisation, which everybody knows is much more difficult. It's more about getting people to stop than it is about seeking to de-radicalise them. Well, a bit more about the second objective. The Prevent duty lies on educational institutions, including universities, although most Prevent referrals from the education sector come from secondary schools. It also lies on health authorities, it lies on police, local authorities, and there are ongoing debates about whether it ought to apply to other public bodies such as the armed forces. That is a duty on these bodies to have due regard to the need to prevent people from being drawn into terrorism. This is the only part of Prevent that is governed by statute. It's the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act 2015. And the process is interminable and complicated. I've tried to summarise it here in 2 lines. The first element to it is a referral to Prevent. So that might classically be, for example, a school teacher who is getting worried that one of their pupils is vulnerable to being drawn into terrorism, in the words of the statute. There is then triage conducted by police, specifically by counter-terrorism police, and that's really a check to see whether there is already anything on this person that is relevant to the decision to take it further. And then the police make a gateway assessment. They ask themselves, is there a reasonable suspicion that a Prevent issue is present, however minor? And if they think that there is, then they send the case for information gathering, where all sorts of agencies are asked, is there anything that you know about this person that we ought to know before we decide whether they really need help? And the cases I was asked to look at, I mean, most things in this area are political, at least in their inspiration, and I was brought in as a non-political, hopefully impartial person to look at Prevent in the wake of the Southport attacks last year, where the attacker had been 3 times referred to Prevent by his school teacher, and the killing of Sir David Amess in Southend in 2021, where again the attacker had been referred by the school teacher. And the Southend attacker fell effectively at the gateway assessment stage. The police, having done the triage, thought there was no need to go as far even as information gathering. The killer of Sir David Amess got further, so he got through information gathering. The case was then referred to channel, and that's the section 36 decision, when you ask, is there reasonable cause to believe that the individual is vulnerable to being drawn into terrorism? And if you get to that reasonable cause to believe, the case can be referred to channel. Channel is a local authority-led multidisciplinary panel which will meet once a month. At the moment it's meeting more often than that because a lot of people are being referred to channel, and they decide whether this is a case that is worth adopting or not. If it's not adopted by channel and the police still feel there is cause for concern, there is a thing called a police-led partnership, which is a slightly obscure mechanism whereby the police can retain control of the case for a little while. And in fact, that happened in the case of Rudakabana, the Southport attacker, although nothing really happened while he was in the PLP. If a case is accepted by the Channel Panel, then there is a duty to put together a support plan. And that will be familiar to anyone who knows about safeguarding or multidisciplinary work. Classically, sitting around the table, it's always a virtual table now, but there will be mental health, there will be education, there will be any other agency that might have something useful to say. Family members might be there as well. Police will always be there. But it's a local authority-led process, and they put a support plan together. So far, so typical of any number of safeguarding mechanisms. The thing that is really unique about Prevent is the potential they have to appoint an intervention provider, which is something they will very often do in cases that are adopted to a Channel Panel. And the theory of an intervention provider, it's the inspirational teacher you never had at school. It's the person who maybe can get on your wavelength, find out what's going on in your head, and maybe try and persuade you out of a dangerous path that you might be on. Very often they're former social workers, they're former teachers, they're former police officers. Increasingly now, because of the trends Julie was referring to, we're getting younger intervention providers who are more at home with digital natives, have a better clue of what might be going on online. But their aim is really to make a connection with the person. And there is never anything compulsory about this. In fact, you don't even have to consent to a support plan if you don't want. You don't have to consent to anything at all. But if you do consent, then the intervention provider will come and see you. Might be typically 4 to 6 times, but it could be a lot more than that if the interaction is useful and the sense is that it's achieving something. It doesn't go on forever. I mean, channel cases are closed really for 3 reasons. I mean, first, if consent is not forthcoming, which is quite common, as I'll show you, or indeed if consent is refused. Secondly, if it seems there's actually something more serious going on, in which case it might be escalated to pursue for a criminal investigation. Or thirdly, and more happily, if there is insufficient continuing concern to merit continued support. So that's, in a nutshell, how Channel works, the second objective. So numbers, the numbers were high last year. They were only published a few days ago, as you can see. They've been fairly constant until 2024-25, ever since the Prevent duty came in 2015. We were looking at sort of 5 to 6, maybe 7,000 Prevent referrals a year. But in that year, 8,778, and a huge spike at the end of last year and the beginning of this year, which I'm not sure anyone's done the regression analysis, but I think the assumption is that this has something to do with the very well publicised trial of the Southport attacker, the knowledge that he had been referred to Prevent, albeit more than 3 years before the attack, and then his guilty plea, which allowed the press to start printing lots of details about him. And perhaps unsurprisingly, there were a lot of sort of better safe than sorry type referrals, including from schools, but not only from schools. And that is at least one explanation. Right at the end of the period, the Adolescence series was screened on television, and some police officers, particularly in London, were making quite public statements about, you know, if you're worried about what your son is watching in his room and you think this might be something dangerous, don't forget there's Prevent. Possibly that had some impact as well, but we may see more of that in the current year. What happened to those people referred? Well, as you see, around 90% male. That applies at all stages of the process. That's pretty consistent. And increasingly young age groups. The median age is 16, 36% of them aged 11 to 15. And some of them younger than that, as was publicised earlier this week, I think in The Independent. Of those 8,778, 20% were referred to Channel. And opponents of Prevent often say, well, this shows it's oppressive and unnecessary because only a small proportion of those that are referred to Prevent actually end up being referred by the police to Channel, passing that Section 36 test. But it's interesting to note that 50% went on to other services for support. So in other words, there was a problem, the person did need support, but perhaps it had more to do with mental health or special educational needs, or perhaps with an older person, some alcohol or drug rehabilitation might be called for. You know, most of the cases, 2/3, a little more than 2/3 of the cases, end up somewhere, but only 20% referred to Channel. And of those, only 54% consented to support. These are quite sensitive, these consent figures. I was allowed to publish them for the first time, buried away in a footnote in Lessons for Prevent. And if you apply yourself carefully to that footnote, you will see that actually the proportions vary as well by ideology that was said to be in issue. So people suspected of having an Islamist ideology, for example, you're looking at relatively low consent rates. Some of the others much higher. But overall, it's only 54%. Types of concern. These statistics are quite difficult, and the parameters have varied over the years, and I suspect that they're not quite there yet in terms of producing something completely reliable. But it's quite striking to look at these figures. The first figure relates to proportion who are referred to Prevent, and the second figure, those that are adopted by channel. The channel panel actually thinks that they need help. So Islamist extremism, you're looking at 10% of those referred to Prevent, although it's 15% of those adopted into channel. Extreme right wing, twice as many being referred to Prevent, 3 times as many being adopted into channel. And you're seeing the sort of the ones it's fashionable to talk about, fascination with extreme violence, multiple ideologies, smaller numbers, at least last year, but again, a relatively high proportion being adopted into channel. And there's this great no identified ideology, which demonstrates really that that channel is not just there for ideology. When it was first introduced, Prevent was seen very much as a way of interrupting what was seen as an ideological path into Islamist terrorism. It was quite overtly all about Muslims who might be tempted by Al-Qaeda and its Salafist, jihadist ideology. But it is now always said that it is not ideological. And if you look at the scholarship, which many of you will know very well, for example, Petter Nesse's book, the Norwegian academic, about European jihadis, he looks at those whose principal motivation is ideological. He looks at those who've come into it because of people they met in prison. And he looks at people who've come into it through friends and family, and he says the second 2 categories are actually bigger than the first one. Of course, terrorism is ideological. That doesn't mean that everyone involved in terrorism is doing it for ideological reasons. But all the same, you're looking at a very high proportion there who are referred to Prevent with no identified ideology, though it's a relatively small proportion of those actually adopted into Prevent. And that, I think, may be some of the better safe than sorry side of things. I said it was the current thing to talk about these people with multiple ideologies, or simply a sort of generalized nihilism, or an obsession with violence, or no ideology at all. I just thought it was interesting to go right back to 1996, when a judge of what we would now call the Supreme Court, Lord Lloyd, was asked to do a report on whether we needed a permanent anti-terrorism law in the United Kingdom, because we'd never had one before. We'd had temporary laws in Northern Ireland, then extended to GB, but we'd never had what actually turned into the Terrorism Act 2000. And he, of course, had a chapter on the threat, as one must always do in these reports, and he outlined what was still happening in Northern Ireland, he outlined what was happening in relation to Palestine and the Middle East, various other threats. And then, I think rather presciently, he said, most significantly of all perhaps, there are indications that some individuals with fanatical leanings or personal grievances are increasingly attracted to terrorist methods. And he predicted that this may come to represent the greatest threat of all in the long term. I'd love to know where he got that from. Presumably some sort of JTAC report from some clever people in the intelligence agencies. But that was the prediction, if you like. And more or less, that is what we are now seeing come to pass. This is Ken McCallum, the current Director General of MI5. He gives an annual speech, and you will see that he is talking about terrorists with only a tenuous grasp of ideology, and crucially, and this goes to what I'll be saying later on about policy, how difficult it is to know at the start whether an act of violence is ideologically motivated or driven by another factor like mental health. And it's not difficult to think of examples. You think of the man that drove the car through the crowds in Liverpool, for example. People simply didn't know. Sometimes you don't know until the trial or after the trial. Ruda Kobana, he certainly had adopted terrorist methods, as Lord Lloyd put it. He'd been manufacturing ricin. He'd bought a knife and he'd shown that he was willing to use it. And yet it was impossible in the end to find a consistent ideology other than an obsessive fixation on or fascination with violence. So that was Ken McCallum. I had a shot at it, but this was cheeky because, you know, this is really Julia's territory and ISD. But this is what I observed and the way I put it. I started with Lloyd, fanatical leanings, personal grievances, how they can be inflamed by geopolitical events, algorithms of social media, a mashup of resentment, rage, rigid certainties, and normalized violence. Extremist content intersects in unpredictable ways. That's a phrase that came to me from a CSO working on the front line. And I sat in a lot of channel panels, and it was fascinating. For example, you know, I can slightly change the facts, and I won't tell you anything that would mean you could identify it. But there was a 12-year-old boy in school who was observed sort of writing Nazi symbols on his arm. And people thought, well, he's a 12-year-old boy. And then 2 weeks later, he was running through the school playground with a rucksack on, shouting Allahu Akbar. And then there were various difficulties about accepting the authority of female teachers and so on. And so a reference was made. And I said in this channel panel what was going on at home. And they said, well, his father's just been convicted for having sex with a horse. And you think, well, where do you start with that one? You know, probably not with a lecture on the Prophet Muhammad, I would think. But, you know, everything gets tangled up. And it's very difficult at the start to know whether you're looking at something ideological or whether you're just looking at a confused young person, perhaps with an obsessive interest in violence. For the first time this month, and this is quite a good time to come and talk to you because this is all new, the Home Office has published statistics relating to mental health. And they said that 34% of referrals had either mental health or neurodiversity issues, 14% with autism spectrum disorder, 9% risk of suicide, 5% risk of self-harm. And as I said in the last bullet point there, there is quite a strong anti-prevent lobby in this country. I've heard people suggest that people suffering from mental ill health or from neurodiversity are the new suspect community. You know, they're how the Irish used to be 40 years ago, or how the Muslims used to be 20 years ago. Other people say, well, sadly, it's unsurprising that some people who are drawn to extreme violence do suffer from mental health and neurodiversity. There is a very new thing. It replaces a thing called vulnerability support hubs. It's called the Clinical Consultancy Service. And that is a service where, which addresses itself to people who present both mental health and counter-terrorism concerns. And these are basically forensic psychiatrists, psychologists, mental health nurses and social workers who are available largely actually to inform the police about the consequences of somebody's mental health issues, but also in some sense to assist doctors if there's something they really ought to know about how the person's been behaving that the police know about. Again, quite controversial, but you can read about that in my report. Is Channel worth it? Well, who knows? There have been some well-publicized failures, and I've listed 3 of them here. Ahmed Hassan was an asylum seeker who had been through Prevent. He'd admitted that he'd been groomed by ISIS, and yet he was, I think, just on the point of being discharged from Prevent when he set off a bomb on the Parsons Green tube. Thankfully, only the detonator went off. Killer of Sir David Amos was similarly someone who engaged in what is called disguised compliance. He pretended he was taking it all on board, and although he got all the way to an intervention provider, and the intervention provider signed a contract to give him 7 sessions, after the first one in a Croydon McDonald's on a Saturday afternoon, the intervention provider said he was a delightful guy, and there was really no need to go any further. So very sadly, a few months later, he bought the knife with which he killed Sir David Amos 5 years later. And then, of course, the Southport attacker. There are also successes, but in the nature of these things, they're more difficult to talk about. The failures are all front-page news across the world. Most of the successes, one assumes, simply fade into obscurity and don't trouble the counter-terrorism machinery for the rest of their lives. And no one really has any idea how many of those people there are. The Home Office told me they think 90% don't present a threat by the time they leave Prevent, but they were quite unable to present any evidence of that to me, so I don't attach any importance to that. But there has been quite a careful evaluation of DDP, which concluded, I think, something like 58% of subjects, largely prisoners who've been convicted, did undergo some improvement in their attitudes. And there is currently a very elaborate independent evaluation of channel. Dr. Paul Gill at UCL, who many of you will know is a real expert in this field, is leading it together with Ipsos UK. They're supposed to be producing an interim report this end of this year and something more permanent end of next year. Because there's so much criticism of Prevent, one thing that surprised me when I got inside it and started looking at it is how much internal criticism and analysis and reform there is. So they're always fiddling about with things. Data recording has recently got much more systematic. There is a new assessment tool. There used to be a tool based on a thing called ERG22+, which acquired a sort of malign mythology in the Prevent space, and which I think, in fact, the police probably would now agree with some of the critics of Prevent wasn't a terribly good tool for assessing risks. There's now a new one which is being trialled, and I'm being trained in it myself next month. It's a pass-fail training with me and lots of police officers, so I'm hoping for a respectable result. Routes to Intervention is a very new one, which I'm not sure I approved of when I first heard about it. This is the possibility of applying Prevent to people who are also under criminal investigation. And you think, well, is that just the police using it as a further means of gaining intelligence for the court? I think the reality is no. The delays in this country now for a Crown Court trial are so huge that if you're a 15-year-old and you've been disseminating terrorist material and your trial isn't going to come on until 2027, it's actually quite useful for there to be someone who can talk to you and keep tabs on you. And that's the sort of case in which this is being used. Lots more transparency. There's a link on the flyer to this to my website, and having realized that, I updated my website, and one of the things I put on it was a link to a Channel 4 film. One thing I said was you should let channel panel training open up to the media so they can tell what's going on. And there's a very interesting film by Ria Chatterjee, a sort of 10-minute film in which she interviews an intervention provider, South Shields, and she watches the channel panel training and explains what's going on. I think we need much more of that. And yeah, enhancing insight. Lots more recommendations, but those are some of the main changes. This is about the anti-Prevent narrative. My sense is it's not as strong as it was. In about 2016, it got to the stage where Andy Burnham, Mayor of Greater Manchester, was saying that it was a toxic brand and he could see no alternative to ending it. The Home Affairs Select Committee was saying it should be renamed as Engage because Prevent had such a bad name among British Muslims. And these are the sorts of issues that are raised not only by Muslims, but by a dedicated cadre of academics and NGOs who produce regular reports, and I reference all those in my own report. Of course, there's an equal and opposite criticism, which is evidenced by a report by William Shawcross, who reported on Prevent in 2023. And he was basically saying that, well, it says there, British Muslims are in denial about Islamist extremism. He was saying there isn't nearly enough emphasis in Prevent on Islamism, and some of these other concerns should be downplayed so we could concentrate on the real threat. Look at all the people in prison. Most of them are Islamists. Look at the MI5 investigations. Most of them are Islamists. And it's quite interesting, this CREST 2020, very large, thorough survey concluded that the results were difficult to reconcile with either of the polarizing narratives, either that Prevent is a toxic brand mistrusted by British Muslims, certainly mistrusted by some of them, but it doesn't actually go as deep as you might think. But equally, it sort of skewered the myth that British Muslims are more tolerant of terrorism or Islamist extremism than anybody else. So that's Shawcross, and I've perhaps rather unfairly, but I mean, it's a very long report, but those are three of the things he was saying. At that time, there were 22% of Islamist referrals as against 10% now, but he still thought that was far too low. He said, I think correctly, that some people who don't necessarily pose a terrorism risk are being referred to Prevent to access other types of much needed support. Prevent has quite a good budget because it's to do with terrorism, and I think some people perceive it as a good way of obtaining help for people who obviously need help. And if that means putting a terror label on it, then you put a terror label on it. His second bullet point is also true, but in a way it's what do philosophers say? True but uninteresting. Because terrorism requires an ideology, it's part of the definition of terrorism. it's obvious that you're not going to find recognized terrorist attacks that are perpetrated in the absence of an ideology, because ideology is part of the definition of terrorism. I think my counter to that would be MUU is mixed, unclear and unstable, by the way, which is the phrase that Julia used, although all the acronyms get updated about every 6 months, and this one is now, for some reason, out of favour. But you could look at Jake Davison, who shot 5 people in a park in Plymouth, including his mother. You could look at the guy who set off a rucksack bomb on a tube train. You could look at a man who was killed when he exploded a bomb outside the Liverpool Women's Hospital. None of those were treated by the police or prosecuted as terrorism, even though they were, as one might say, terrorist adjacent. Certainly in the case of the first 2, there had been flirtation with, in one case, an incel website, in one case with far-right websites, but there didn't seem to be enough to form any coherent ideology. If you think things like that are as serious as terrorism, and they're certainly very difficult to tell apart from terrorism, one begins to see the argument for allowing Prevent to deal with them. So, having been brought in to explain how dreadful Prevent was after it had failed in the cases of Southport and Sir David Amess, I did make a long string of recommendations, but I also, by the end of my 6 months looking at Prevent, felt I needed to stick up for it just a bit. Because, as I said here, it has implacable enemies and critical friends. So some people say it lacks teeth because you need consent. Other people say it's a sinister abuse of state power, chilling expressive and associative freedoms. Some people say it stigmatizes Muslims. That was certainly the narrative 10 years ago, that the whole thing was a plot against the peaceful practice of Islam. Or there's the Shawcross criticism, it's too easy on Islamists, you should be concentrating more on where the real threat is in terms of dead bodies and terrorist prisoners. There's the question of ideology. Is it modish to be looking too much at these MUU people when you should be focusing on the ideologies we know and love? And then there's the counter, that you've got to move with the times, and the TikTok generation are not taking the time to steep themselves in a single ideology in the way that they used to. And then, almost most toxic of all, is the political criticism of Prevent, which happens every time something goes off, and the guy was in Prevent, which is look what it says on the tin, Prevent. Well, it didn't do it, did it? And it doesn't matter if it was 7 years before, like Sir David Amess's killer, or 3-4 years before, like Ruda Cabana. It must be the fault of Prevent. So lots of criticisms from all directions. I took the view, in terms of the anti-Prevent lobby, I take it very seriously. I take its criticism seriously. Some people who've written on Prevent have kind of said, well, these people are inspired by the Muslim Brotherhood, or just look who they shared a platform with, and they're out to destabilize a state. I don't think that's actually a good enough answer. If they have raised something that needs to be looked into on the evidence, then it should be looked into on the evidence. So I met those people, I continue to meet them, and I continue to take very seriously what they have to say. Prevent has to justify itself to the public, not least because it entirely relies on consent, in the obvious sense that a person needs to consent to treatment, but also, the teacher or the doctor needs to feel they trust Prevent enough to make a referral, and a CSO or a business that might be thinking of tendering for a contract with Prevent needs to feel that this is not going to be something that debases them in the views of their community. So it totally depends on trust, and you've really got to take the criticism seriously. That's why you have a Prevent commissioner. But when you meet these intervention providers, I watched that Channel 4 clip, or I made a radio program actually in 2017, which begins with an interview with an 18-year-old Nazi, and then with the intervention provider that turned him round. And I really defy anyone to listen to those and say Prevent can't work. It could work better, it could work more often, but there is that rather inspiring thing at the centre of it. So which direction is it going to go? Shawcross's recommendations were all accepted by the government, but I wouldn't say that we're seeing an increased focus on the Islamist threat. In fact, only half as many Islamists are now being referred as they were in the year when he reported. But that is certainly one possibility of the future direction. Then there's more what I'm saying, which is also very much what the Bingham Centre is saying. You probably saw we had a Counter-Terrorism Commission that reported last week. And the first thing there is threat of mass violence. Get these violence-fixated individuals within Prevent. Raises bigger questions about other aspects of the contest framework, do they need to accommodate these people in the same way? Easier to accommodate them in prevent because it's the canary in the coal mine. It's a preliminary stage. You're only looking at people who might go on to be terrorists. You're not looking at people who already have all the characteristics of a terrorist. But it seems to me that you're simply splitting hairs if you're saying the Southport killer should not have been accepted for prevent because his ideology was insufficiently fixed. And then what I really put my weight behind, and so did Bingham, is a wide front door, as we called it, which is instead of having to refer people to prevent, why would anyone, friend or family or teacher, actually want to send people through a door that says terror over the top? Why would you want to do that to somebody? But if you could send them through a door saying, troubled person, needs safeguarding, even risk of violence, you then get a proper multidisciplinary triage. The huge majority of people are going to need disposals that are completely different from the ideologically based disposal, but you could still keep prevent as in the back, as a kind of back end of the process, so that if somebody could benefit from an ideological intervention provider, then that should be available to them. It kind of satisfies the critics from both wings. The Shawcross people would like it because you would be preserving the, as they see it, essentially ideological nature of prevent. It wouldn't need to extend into other sorts of need. And a lot of the critics of prevent that I've run it past have also been very enthusiastic about it because they avoid, it would avoid what they see as the stigma of being referred to prevent, which is probably one of the reasons it doesn't work as well as it should. It would also provide a way of handing off the risk to other people. So if someone's rejected from prevent, the ball can be dropped sometimes in the current system. It would avoid that. I better hurry up. I don't know so much about counter-extremism. This is the latest definition from the government. To my mind, it's better than the previous definitions, of which there have been several. But it's still extraordinarily broad. If you look at it, particularly number 1, and particularly number 3, create a permissive environment for others to achieve the results in 1 and 2. So what is the point of defining extremism? I think it depends why you're doing it. If you are setting standards which public authorities should apply in deciding whether they can engage with somebody else, whether it's giving them grants or using them as intervention providers or whatever, I entirely see the point. It's necessary to have a rule of thumb like that. But if you're trying to use it as a basis for criminal offences or coercive powers, I think it is fraught with difficulty because all the definitions that I have seen are terribly broad. And I don't think it's sensible to try and manufacture a thing called extremism. We have quite specific laws in this country about things like religious hatred, racial hatred, terrorism, and so on. In my view, it's better trying to work with what you've got rather than going for a one-size-fits-all, which is inevitably going to be overbroad. What about prevent? Well, again, I think as the prevent duty guidance says, it's reasonable that teachers, doctors, etc., should be alert to divisive or intolerant narratives which can reasonably be linked to terrorism, and counter-extremism work can be useful on that. But should prevent be the main mechanism for delivering counter-extremism policy? Absolutely not. If you're trying to affect how people think, if you're trying to dissuade them from ideas that are massively socially harmful, why would you go in wearing a tabard saying terrorism on the front? I mean, I just cannot see that's a productive way of doing it. So I think I would rather align myself with Professor Clive Walker from the University of Leeds, who's my great mentor in counter-terrorism law, and in fact with Dame Sarah Khan, who was the first chair of the Counter-Extremism Commission, that a securitized approach to a societal problem is probably not the way to go. It's not that counter-extremism isn't important, but it's probably better as part of some sort of cohesion or integration or critical thinking or public education or public health type strategy than it is as part of CT. So I rather resist those who describe prevent as counter-extremism. I think it's, as it always has been, counter-terrorism. So I think that's it from me. I've overrun a bit, but very happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much for this brilliant presentation, and also it was great that you integrated the latest statistics and the latest numbers. I think that was really, it couldn't have been any timelier to have you here today. I want to use my privilege as the host and ask you the first question, but then I will open up to the audience. And I was wondering about the international perception of PREVENT, which from the onset was actually quite positive. It was so interesting, even back in the days in 2016, or 2017, there were a lot of, internationally, there was a lot of attention being given to PREVENT, which was painted in a very positive light and even inspired some other counter or radicalization prevention approaches, including in Australia, but also other countries that tried to learn lessons from PREVENT. Which was at odds with somehow with the more critical perception within the country. Would you say that today there's perhaps also an opposite scenario? Are there other places in the world where you think we could learn something from them in terms of their approaches to radicalization?
And I think you're right that PREVENT is well regarded internationally. And it's usual when you live somewhere and you see all the defects, you forget that for a lot of people it's a reasonably good model. I had the great help, as you well know, Julia, of somebody who used to work at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, which is your other home. Which has a Safer Cities initiative and has made a really serious study of comparative PREVENT. And there is an appendix to my report, which is not my work, it is his work. His name is Daniel Hooton. And he studied 3 countries, which were Germany, the Netherlands, and New Zealand. And he tried to draw some lessons from the way they approach these issues. Incidentally, in none of those countries does it seem there is any very significant anti-PREVENT movement, which is a sign that perhaps they're doing something right. And I think it's fair to say as well that they are closer to having a big front door. In some cases, actually a physical front door, where there is actually a place where you can go, a bricks and mortar place where you can go, which perhaps seems strange when so much radicalization is online, but definitely a lot to learn. I put those in partly because I hope a Committee of Parliament will look at this, and I hope they probably couldn't afford a trip to New Zealand, but I'm hoping they might say, let's go to the Netherlands, or let's go to Germany, and see if there's anything there for us.
Great. Shall we take the first questions from here in the room? And I will then also ask some questions from the online participants. Let's start with you here.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you for coming and the good presentation we have. I'm Fatima Ali. I'm from Somalia, a country that has experienced counter-extremism. And I was working with the Center of Somalia's Counter-Terrorism in 2022. We have studied non-military approach that government can fight with or prevent and counter-terrorism. And we have come up solution that there is a lot of mental health that the societies that have experienced it on civil war, conflict, all these issues had a mental health. And one of the reasons is that people join extremism is that they may not get societal support within the institution or within the society. So my question is, how other countries can get an experience from the UK's progress on the mental health regarding on one of the approach that to counter and prevent the extremism?
Well, I'm sure that the clinical consultancy service would be an interesting place to start. I've spoken a lot to the forensic psychiatrists, psychologists, and the nurses who work there, and they're very dedicated to what they do. They're a big target of the anti-prevent lobby because it's said that they are tempted to disclose confidential patient information, which they shouldn't do, and it's said that they have professional duties which they are not complying with by working at the CCS. I think that's much overdone. There are lots of exceptions for national security and public safety and so on when it comes to sharing information. And they just seem people who are quite committed to what they're doing. I've sat in case conferences where they are explaining to police what the real problem is. And I think the more the police can understand mental health and what its impact might be, the better. But I mean, that doesn't really answer the central question of whether it is appropriate for people like this to be in a counter-terrorism intervention or whether they should be in a mental health intervention. I think probably the answer is you do need expertise from both sides. It's also a difficult subject to talk about, particularly people with ASD, because no one wants to feel blamed or to be part of a suspect minority or whatever. And there's some quite useful research for that purpose saying that that mental health and neurodiversity can actually be a protective factor as well as an aggravating factor in terms of inclination to extreme violence. But no, I'm sure, if you would like to get in touch with me, I'd be happy to put the Somali government onto the right people for them to talk to. And nowadays with Zoom and so on, it could be probably quite easily done.
Do we have one in the back here? Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Mark from France. You talked about how Prevent is regarded abroad and also how the UK can get inspired by other systems. My question is, how does the UK Prevent strategy engage in international cooperation to reduce the risk of radicalization across borders? So do you think it's the role of Prevent also to cooperate with other states?
Yes, I mean, there is an international element to Prevent, which I don't know very much about. I referred to it at the start of my report, but it wasn't relevant to the cases I was looking at. So if I were doing this job for longer, it's certainly something I would want to look at. But we spend quite a lot of money, actually, on de-radicalization initiatives in other countries. I don't know very much about how it's spent. Closer to home, the 4 Ps that David Oman thought up in his bath have been widely exported, even to the European Union, which renamed one of the Ps so that it began with R. I can't remember why, so it's PPPR. But the same 4 are part of their instruments, I think even of a directive. So in that sense as well, there used to be, at any rate, a productive dialogue. Sadly, perhaps not quite so productive now.
There's one question from an online participant about the role of foreign policy in, I guess, in the radicalization pathways that you see. Perhaps you've witnessed how Channel deals with grievances around foreign policies of the UK government, because it's probably a tricky balance sometimes if Prevent is perceived as something government-led, but at the same time, grievances about the policies might feed into radicalization pathways.
Yes, I mean, there's an issue, a very difficult issue of the sort of people you should ask to become intervention providers. Now, if you look at that Channel 4 film, which is on my website, you'll see that Ahmed, the intervention provider in South Shields, says that he used to be a member of Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is now a proscribed organization. It wasn't proscribed when he was a member of it, but a lot of people still thought it should be. And you can imagine that the sort of conversation that he might have with a Prevent subject about foreign policy would not be exactly the conversation you would have with the Foreign Secretary. Now, there is a view that you shouldn't allow people who have been extremists or have been members of proscribed organizations to be involved as mentors. But I think there is another view, which is quite credible to me, that if you choose the right people, they might have a bit more reach because they're able to speak the language of the people that they're trying to talk to, and they have some credibility. I mean, I know quite well an intervention provider, I've known him for years, who fought in Bosnia and fought jihad, and is now a very good person to go and see if you're 19 years old and you've been watching the wrong videos, and you can talk to a guy who's been there and done it. He's now completely the opposite, I hasten to add. Yes, so I think it depends who's doing the talking, really. And because these sessions are private, there is no civil servant looking over their shoulders saying you shouldn't have said that. And I suppose their objective is to take anger and resentment, which may be very well justified, but to try and find a peaceful and productive outlet for them. Hence, disengagement rather than de-radicalization.
Absolutely, yeah. And also the advantage of former extremists is probably also that they intuitively understand the different patterns in radicalization pathways and can help with each of those really address the underlying grievances. Yeah. Great, a lot of questions. Okay, let's take one here and then we go over to the middle section.
Hi there, my name's Eleanor. I'm a student here at Blavatnik. My question is about the resilience of Prevent as a strategy, given it was first introduced by a Labour government in 2006. That's quite a long lifetime for a strategy, evolving through multiple governments. And I wonder if you could comment on that against the international backdrop of sort of politicization of far-right ideology.
It actually started in 2003, although only in a very small way. And it was after the, as you say, the 7/7 attacks in London that it really got going. It did start off as something entirely concerned with Muslims, and that changed gradually. I think the Anders Breivik attack in Norway was absolutely key to that. When you look at the sheer, I think 77 people killed, and a very overt ideology left behind, which made it very clear how he was thinking. And it became actually much easier to sell Prevent to Muslim communities where it had been very unpopular when you were able to demonstrate that it was not just a program that was aimed at them, as frankly it had been. It had been aimed at some Muslims at the start. And so in a way, conservative governments leapt on this and were very keen to stress the far-right element of it. And it was they who started publishing statistics. Ben Wallace, when he was Security Minister in 2016, was the first to start publishing statistics. And we now see twice as many far-right are referred, 3 times as many accepted into channel. So I think it sort of helped left and right, if you're going to look at it cynically and politically, to be able to say, this is ideology neutral. We're just interested in any ideology that has a propensity to lead to violence. So I don't think it's been a political football exactly in that way. And I think always people have seen the point of it. It's been very far from perfect, but it's only 3% of our counter-terrorism budget. It's much cheaper than pursue, protect and prepare. And why wouldn't you want to? When Robert Peel founded the police in 1829, his first policing principle was that the police should be there to prevent crime. Why wouldn't you want to do prevention? Why would you focus everything on cure?
Yeah. Let's start with the question in the front row, and then we'll go to the back row.
Hello, thank you for that. It was very informative. My name's Dr. Sekinaz. I'm a clinical psychologist and past president of the British Association for Behaviour and Cognitive Psychotherapies. A lot of my work is involved in inequalities in society and impact on mental health. So I've known people to be referred to prevent wrongly by their psychologists, and they've not been able to complete their treatment, and they're left hanging on like really strong medication, and there's nothing there for them. So I think that's something we need to think about a bit more, but also we need to think about the wider inequalities in society, like the youth centres have closed down, and actually what is the role of that, and the data that you've presented today. So I think that's where the real prevention is going to happen. I think by the time they come in to prevent, something's already gone wrong in society. So I just wonder, are you aware of any initiatives that think about some of these issues?
Well, on your first point, I'd be very interested in anything you wanted to tell me privately or wanted to share with me about people being wrongly referred to prevent and this affecting their treatment. I think that's something that sounds as though it really needs to be looked into.
Yeah, happy to.
In terms of the decay of civil society and state funding for youth clubs, I couldn't agree more. Unfortunately, counter-terrorism is one of those areas that remains quite well funded, and that's one of the reasons, as I was trying to say earlier, why people are sometimes routed by very well-meaning people into prevent, because they think, for example, they'll get a quicker CAMS diagnosis, a child adolescent mental health diagnosis through prevent than they would otherwise. It's not necessarily true, but people think that it might be true. And it's why some people with urgent problems that clearly need to be looked at get that label stuck on them, which is plainly not ideal. But other than sort of funding everything properly, which is obviously what we should be doing, it's difficult for me to suggest a solution. I mean, my solution in a way is the big front door, where you take this stigma off the door and you concentrate on the societal problem, not on the ideology, and then the ideology comes up at the back end in those few cases where it's actually relevant.
And also very relevant to that, we've seen a really strong uptick in the hijacking of hobby communities among extremist movements where, different, especially white nationalist movements, but also across the spectrum, they've tried to form their own fitness or sports clubs and their own youth communities, which is a really dangerous path because it is filling a vacuum that is definitely there. Yeah. Okay, I think I did say first, you've been holding your hand up for some time in the third row, and then we'll go to you as well. Sorry if I got the order wrong. We do still have a few minutes, so we'll probably cover up all of your questions.
Thank you. My name's Hannah. I'm a student at the Department of International Development. You discussed at the beginning the focus on disengagement as opposed to de-radicalisation. And I just wonder why de-radicalisation hasn't been as big as part. Is that a reflection of funding or perhaps a lack of focus on that expertise? And how much do you think that sort of integrating a process of de-radicalisation could be a benefit to the wider process?
Well, Julia probably has a better informed answer to this. I'd be interested to see what she says. I think it's really because de-radicalisation is just really difficult. I used to talk to a lot of young men who come back from Syria during the time when ISIS was in charge. Some of them were very critical, but they were critical of their leaders, they were critical of the tactics, they were critical of the pay. And I don't think I talked to anyone who'd said, oh, I've just realised the ideology was all wrong. Because if you've been fooled or duped or led astray, it's psychologically quite difficult, I think, to admit that. But there may be countries that have cracked it better than we have. What do you think?
I think a really integrated approach is needed to tackling the different dimensions in radicalization and helping people to reintegrate. And I do think it includes both the ideological level, but also the psychological level. And very often we see that on the psychological and especially the deeper identity and group dynamics, they sometimes lag behind, even if on an ideological level you might have emancipated yourself from an extremist belief or distanced yourself. There might still be some underlying psychological issues and also social dynamics that often play a very strong role, because often the identities of people who join extremist groups are permanently shaped by some of the dysphoric experiences or also sometimes traumatic experiences. So I do think that also plays a huge role in rehabilitation and in the reintegration process.
I think there are a couple more.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I was at the Bingham Centre report last week, and one of the things the chair said there was sort of about the need to keep up with the pace of technology. So I was just wondering if you could comment on sort of how you find the frontline practitioners and their keeping pace with technology, and what kind of support do they get from that, from either HMG or local gov? Like, is there a TikTok 101 session, that sort of thing?
Yes, I'm not sure what you mean by the practitioners. I mean, one of my recommendations, as you might have seen, was that there should be a unit within the police to coordinate their open source intelligence. I'm not recommending any new spooky powers for covert surveillance, but as part of the information gathering, they should be seeing what traces people have left that might be sinister. I know it's difficult, there's a lot of encryption and so on. And I think generally the prevent duty was designed for an analog age. It was designed on the assumption there was a responsible adult in the room. Ruda Cabana's third reference to prevent was because he was actually in a bricks and mortar classroom under the gaze of a physical human teacher when on his computer he searched for London Bridge attacks. And she saw that out of the corner of her eye and came up and talked to him. And after a 30-minute conversation, she thought, this guy really needs help. How many other searches had he done in the privacy of his own home without anybody having any idea where he was? And so I hope people are going to start thinking about this. And again, I tried to give them a bit of space in my report, because it's very easy to close everyone down by saying civil liberties, you can't do that. And I think it's something we need to look at, because there are an awful lot of completely ungoverned spaces out there. The platforms often don't seem very minded to govern them. And whether you can do more with the platforms, whether you can do more with sort of public-spirited citizens who might be there and see what's going on. I think what you probably can't do is send the government in to police everything. So really difficult issues to which I'm afraid I have no answers. But ISD and also a group called Tech Against Terrorism, you probably know, have done some quite good thinking on this.
Yeah. Great. Let's take one more question,
or two really quick ones, if you like.
We combined two questions.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Luna. I'm a student from history faculty, and I know little about the policymaking and implementation of this issue. So I'm just curious about the major parties' opinions about this issue, and will the policymaking and the implementation be, how much will be affected by which party leads the government? Thanks.
Yeah, okay, well, while the microphone is moving, I'll answer that. I think it's been pretty much a bipartisan policy until now. I mean, you could see the difference between, what Shawcross was saying. I mean, perhaps that had more resonance on the right, where he's saying, he said there are too many people being referred for extreme right-wing concerns, when in fact they had views, for example, about immigration that are perfectly commonplace among a large segment of the population. If you want, you could see that as a right-wing view. But I think the police are actually rather good about this. They say, well, you can't, we can't make these judgments. You can't tell us to be more right-wing or more left-wing. We've got to apply what it says in the Act. We've got to try and assess whether people are vulnerable to being drawn into terrorism. And we're not going to be distracted by suggestions that we should be going for more Muslims or more skinheads or whatever it might be. Yeah.
Some years ago, under the Prevent programme overseas, I talked to journalists in the Middle East, and that prompts me to ask whether, when you were looking at Prevent, you found a media unit that was working proactively rather than reacting. You're shaking your head already.
No, I mean, I think there's been a sense in Prevent that they're being besieged. That's why, in a way, I wanted to stick up for them a bit. They had RICU, which did these strategic communications, and it was all supposed to be about counter-speech. And you get these really clever little Islamic State videos, and after about 6 months, somebody would come up with a kind of government-approved bit of counter-speech, which wasn't always massively effective. And then I don't think there's been much. I mean, there've been people who've gone out into communities and they've spoken to people, but I think they've always felt they were rather on the back foot. They took a lot of persuading to get Channel 4 along to the channel panel training, and I'm so glad they did, because it wasn't a whitewash, but I think if you watch that, you'll get a sense for how it really is a safeguarding mechanism. It's not just a counter-terrorism tool pretending to be a safeguarding mechanism. And I think more than strategic communications, in a way, you need to open it up. You need transparency. The last big report I did was on investigatory powers. At the time of Edward Snowden, he stole all this information. Everyone thought, this is terrible, GCHQ is spying on us, the NSA is spying on us. And I don't blame them for saying that, because almost nothing was in the public domain. And the answer to that was to declassify 1,500 pages of information, most of it actually really dull. And once everyone had read it, they started asking, instead of saying, you've betrayed us, you're dishonest and all the rest of it, they started saying, well, why exactly do we need this power? And why aren't there more safeguards on that one? And that was where a political debate needs to be. And I think that's probably the answer to Prevent as well. Prise it out of the grip of people whose instinct is to keep everything secret. Show people a bit more about how it actually works. And at that point, I'm afraid a lot of people are going to lose interest, because it is, in most respects, a safeguarding mechanism with one rather admirable add-on, which is the intervention provider.
Great, I think we're at time, but we'll head out to the reception, and I would just like to invite you to give Lord David Anderson a huge round of applause.
Thank you.
And I think there's plenty to discuss in the future. Perhaps in the future there will be AI-based interventions in the online sphere, in the metaverse. So there might be all kinds of new ways of preventing individuals from joining extremist groups. On this note, we have another seminar, which is actually the closing seminar of this series, happening next Tuesday at 5 p.m. here again at Blavatnik School, where we'll be talking about the future, or we'll be talking about the rising threats of authoritarianism, threats to democracy, and radicalization. And we'll be joined by Dr. Leos Migrod and Professor A.C. Grayling. So I would love for you to come and join us again, whether it's online or here in person. Thank you.
Thank you.